Hey guys, Sleepy Reader here. I had some thoughts triggered by a great, very long video by James Donnelly about comics in the. I'm trying to look at the whole title. Show me YouTube. Comics in the 90s and the Two Books That Changed Everything was the name of his video. It was over an hour long, but it's well worth listening to as he ponders the 90s and eventually tells us about these two most important books of the 90s that set up comic books for the way they are now. And those two, to spoil it, sorry, James, you should go watch James's video first, were Kingdom Come and Marvels. I happen to own Kingdom Come, haven't read it in a really long time, and I've actually forgotten most of it, except that it's about the superheroes when they're old. So I need to go back and read this. I'm quite excited to now that all of James has said about it. I also just recently ordered Marvels. Will be coming to me from In Stock Trades any day now. So I'm excited to get that and read that. I do remember that more vividly, but look forward to rereading it. And James talked a lot about the 90s, and then he talked a good deal about these very fine books and what makes them so important. But it just triggered in me the whole thinking about how Watchmen was so influential, and we talk about huge changes that happened in the late 80s or in the 90s and now. And it just, pardon me, made me, it occurred to me how, if you look at it from the right perspective, comic books have always been going through these massive evolutions. From wherever we are now, certain things seem like they changed everything. But things had changed a lot before Watchmen and had major evolutions. And I think each era of comics is revolutionary in a way, if you look at it from the right angle. You have the very beginnings of comics, which was a revolution of superheroes. The whole concept of superheroes, crude as they were at first, was revolutionary. Certainly you can find antecedents, but there was nothing like superheroes before Superman came along, really. And there was nothing like comic books until like 1938, I think, or 37. They were the crude younger brother of comic strips at first, but they are a evolutionary and revolutionary jump from comic strips. And a whole language rapidly developed from there, thanks to people like Jack Kirby and Will Eisner and Joe Kubert, who just died, and many others, and many of them geniuses in their own way, others just hardworking artists. So we had the whole explosion of superheroes, and that was a revolution in itself, and people call that the golden age of comics. Although most of the time I don't enjoy when I read old reprints of those. They're so primitive seeming. And we did have, very shortly after that, Will Eisner bringing back the comic book to the newspaper and doing 7-page stories every week in a comic book format, but one that was meant to appeal to children and adults with the spirit. And that was very revolutionary, although it took a long, long time for the rest of comics to reabsorb that. And then in the 50s, there's all kinds of revolutions that, there was the whole EC thing. EC was kind of the pinnacle of the short story horror comic book, which we still have around here and there, and lasted a long time, and has huge influence still on what everyone does. But then in the later 50s, we had things that... So we may take all of those for granted, and then another thing we tend to take for granted is the Silver Age revolution in the 1950s in DC. And what we had there was Julie Schwartz, who's a longtime science fiction person, editor, brought into comic books. He brought in a lot of science fiction writers to comic books, most notably Gardner Fox, I guess. But they brought a lot of a science fictional approach to heroes. The Flash and Green Lantern and Adam Strange, and everything had kind of a science, or a lot of stuff had a science fiction kind of base to it. And they brought in lots of clever kinds of science fiction elements, which are still huge in comic books. Huge in comic books. And then we have Stan Lee and Jack Kirby revolutionizing things again. But it wasn't just Jack Kirby. It was Steve Ditko and Gene Colan and a number of other people who I should think of off the top of my head. And so I think at the center of that was Stan Lee, and bringing a new level of, for lack of a better term, humanity. At the time they called it realism. Now it doesn't seem at all realistic to us the way Stan Lee comics of the 60s were. But he brought personality to comics. He brought a whole level of personality to regular, everyday, monthly superhero comics that just weren't there before, so that you felt the people making comics were kind of your friend. And you also felt that you had a connection to the superheroes beyond just your childish connection, because every child thinks it's really cool if you could wear a red cape and fly. And along with those elements, Stan Lee and then other writers working sort of under Stan Lee developed more and more sort of sophisticated, for its time, characterization. And that was a huge revolution. It took DC a long time to catch up with that. But I think every creator who came afterwards was started out as a Marvel reader, and they brought that Marvel quality to things. And then even in the 70s, which seem a little more fallow, Stan Lee stopped creating. And we had some smaller revolutions, but that ones that over time seeped in to comics. And one revolution, again, came from Jack Kirby. It was something he was doing at Marvel, but he amped it up. And it wasn't the most important element at Marvel, but the whole cosmic story and the huge metaphorical battles between good and evil, which were then expanded very well by the likes of Jim Starlin. Jim Starlin did brilliant work with Captain Marvel and Warlock, and maybe he would have done that work even if Jack Kirby hadn't done the New Gods and such, but there seems to be a connection there. And that thread has now become a permanent part of comics. And also, in a harder to quantify revolution was a return to horror comics in the 70s, but done in a new way, pulling in some of this Stan Lee stuff, but pulling in some other kind of more literary approaches, if you will. If you look at Dracula of the time, The Tomb of Dracula was brilliant, and you look at the shorter-lived series like Frankenstein and Werewolf by Night and the Man Thing and the Swamp Thing, they were just sort of an interesting psychological ongoing horror story, a new way to do horror, I believe, that I don't think you saw in horror novels or horror movies at the time either. So that was a quieter revolution. It kind of died out for a while, but it keeps popping back up. And right now we see its influence on, Animal Man and Swamp Thing and several of the other dark DC comics. Not to mention a lot of indie comics. We see that horror thread that I think has an EC to the Marvel horror period, with Swamp Thing thrown in for good measure. And then now the modern kind of Steve Niles and all the rest of the really good independent kind of horror creators. And then at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, we had a new revolution which drew upon so many of these things and amped it up to a new level of realism, which with its strongest component being Frank Miller. And what he did with Daredevil at the time was just kind of mind-blowing. It was, it still wasn't as violent, but it was more violent than everything else, and it was more emotional and more gritty feeling, and the interlocking of all the elements is also what we see now with all our sophisticated writing. I began right around then, and mostly, to my knowledge, with Frank Miller, but with lots of other writers contributing smaller parts. And then we had, connected to that, I think allowed us to bring in people like Alan Moore, allowed the comic book world to bring in people like Alan Moore and let them really go to town. And it turned out that this guy Alan Moore was a genius, and he revolutionized things with Swamp Thing and then Watchmen and many other shorter-lived comics. So you have all those revolutions. And then we come up to the 90s with James Donnelly's brilliant analysis of what was going on there. My own personal 90s was all about Vertigo and other independent comics, things from Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly. I think they were around then, and other small, very small things. And that's probably a different thread, although all of that Vertigo stuff has really come back into all comics now. And the Vertigo revolution was based on Alan Moore, I guess, and then pumped up by Neil Gaiman, but lots of other great things done by other writers, and a seemingly brilliant editor of Karen Berger. So anyway, I just wanted to throw out that, inspired by James, I just sort of saw this endless rolling wheel of mini revolutions throughout comics. And it's really neat to trace them all. And it can be why really old comics look so weird to those, depending on where you started reading comics, can look really weird compared to what's going on now, because comics really are a heavily evolving art form. I think you can, or at least for a while, you could see that evolution in rock and roll. But it's pretty hard to see that kind of evolution in literature. I don't know. You probably could have when you went back a long way back to the first beginnings of poetry, and then the novel and the short story, etc. But in the last 50 years of literature, I don't think you can, at least I don't know of that kind of clear series of evolutions. So comic books are like this really cool petri dish of creativity. Things are always bubbling over and changing. One of the reasons I love comics. So, and one of the reasons I love videos done by people like James who really think about these things. Agent 42Q has had some really good thought pieces lately too. In fact, one of them was a response to another video of James's about the top 10 creative runs, and they have a little dialogue going on between them that's really cool. So this is Sleepy Reader checking out. Talk to y'all later.